All right, if you would, go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Ruth. We are going to be in Ruth chapter 1. Now, let me just simply remind you, last week as we were in chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, we really dealt initially with a bit of the setting, the setup. And we talked about some of the main players that are involved and essentially how Elimelech had led his family to go to Moab, heading east, just going out over where the Dead Sea was to a place called Moab, away from Bethlehem, because there was famine in the land and they were going to where they heard you could work for grain. They were there 10 plus years. In the course of that, their sons, Mahlon and Chilion, had married Orpah and Ruth. And along the way, Elimelech dies, and then so do the two sons. And all that's left are Naomi, the mom and the wife, again, a Jew, an Israelite, and her two foreign daughters, two Moabite daughters, Orpah and Ruth. And that's what brings us to what we're going to talk about today, which is, it's a further setup, but it's really the setup for the story of redemption. We've entitled this series, Ruth, A Story of Redemption and Grace. And what we start to see today is not just the circumstances, but some of the immediate decisions and transitions that occur that begin to lay the foundation for what will be an incredibly beautiful redemptive story. A lot of grace. And so I think you'll see, hopefully we'll get a clue from this in not necessarily perfectly how God works. In fact, we do have to find ourselves in the position of being comfortable of not knowing what God is doing or why God is doing something and yet still trusting Him. But I think we can see a little bit of this idea that this is one of 66 books. That's a pretty decent percentage. This is a significant story. And this story presents this concept, this idea that God sees fit to draw and bring Himself the most glory through redemptive work. And ultimately, that's not through the romance that occurs between Boaz and Ruth, or that Naomi gets taken care of. It's not through all of that, or that even the people in Bethlehem are preserved, but it's more in where it's heading, because we see these names pop up in the lineage of Christ. It's up against the backdrop of crisis, but not just crisis for food, the crisis of sin and lostness and fallenness. It's up against some kind of antagonistic backdrop that will find redemption. So, we do not ignore when sin has been brought to our attention, either for the first time and we come to faith in Christ and we are born again, we are brought to faith, or as believers and we see that we are at a crisis of faith because of circumstances. We seem to not be able to reconcile that God is good, God is sovereign, and I'm really going through it right now. And we will either, deconstruct and change and reconstruct our faith to accommodate what makes sense to us, which invariably means you're probably going to limit God's power, limit God's authority, or perhaps limit His goodness altogether, as long as you're trying to fit it in this framework. And yet His ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. It's incredibly important what we do in moments of crisis. And that's part of the setup of what we see today in verses 6 through 22. So let's first look at verses 6 through 18. We're going to talk about the considerations in this crisis. What were the considerations going on? Well, let me go ahead and read the passage first. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab, again, she was there to work for grain to feed the family, that the Lord had visited His people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you that you may find rest, each of you in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will not return with you. We will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband." If I should say I have hope, even I should have a husband this night and should bear sons. Would you therefore wait till they're grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? She said to them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. We're going to talk about really just three main considerations. These are in your outline in the insert in your bulletin. The first one is safety. I mean, she's in the moment of this crisis, and this crisis is from several different angles. I mean, the global crisis going on for her is that they are in a foreign land, or at least Naomi is, and because of a famine, she's been completely displaced, which we talked about last week. But in the course of this, she's lost everything that would give her hope in this world. Because again, you're dealing with an overarching patriarchal society where everything for the wife would be tied to the husband, and everything of future would be tied to their children and their offspring. Well, during those 10 years that the two sons were married to these two ladies, they never had children. She could not have been in a more hopeless situation just from a societal standpoint. So I think it's pretty significant that right off the bat, her first thought is for everyone's safety. I mean, I'm sure she would have loved the company, but you see what she's doing here in verses 6 through 10. She gets up, they start to leave, and they all start to go together, and she stops and says no. And there's a couple of interactions. The first one, when she says, you need to go back. You need to be with your own people and stay with your own families, have your own sense of safety, and essentially saying you don't, not in a mean way, you don't belong with me, but essentially saying what's best for you is to remain here. She probably would have loved the company. You see the perspective. We read 19 through 21. Her perspective when she went back into Jerusalem was, don't even call me Naomi, because her name means delight. Call me Mara, which means bitter. I mean, this has seeped down to her very identity of what's happened to her. It has changed her. And she clearly sees this as a result of God's hand. Now, we're not given commentary in the book of Ruth on whether or not that's okay. There are many people today that would say, oh, you shouldn't blame God for everything that occurs. And yet there's others, and I'd probably be more in that camp, not necessarily in an extreme way where we are like, well, just deal with it. It's God. Certainly not. But I do think we rush too quickly to give natural causes to certain events in our lives instead of going, God, you are doing something, and it hurts, and I don't understand, but I trust you. She clearly sees this as being from the hand of God. She's been dealt a hand from the hand of God that is too much for her to bear alone. And yet, for their safety, she says, go back. Now, I think it's important to see a couple of things that she says in this, because she says, go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you. In Mesopotamia, when they would refer to this into the mother's house, and it actually was consistent as well, not just with Mesopotamia and the larger region, which would include Israel as well as Moab, but this was a consistency. When you refer to mother's house, that is the place of basically where you would be prepared for marriage, when there was that angle on looking at the home. So go to your mother's house, because in that, when the Lord deals kindly with you, hopefully you will marry. In fact, she references that in just a minute. In verse 9, the Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Okay, so when you mention husband or father's house, then you're getting into safety, because that was protection and provision. That's how they talked about. It could be the same household, but they talked about it in two different ways. The mother's house was to prepare you for marriage, which was fruit-bearing, and that's where you'd be taken care of in your old age. But also, in the father's house, that's where protection and provision would occur immediately. They had that waiting for them in their home. Naomi did not, at least not in Moab. In Moab, as a widow, you were essentially a homeless person. She had to go back home, but it's interesting. She goes back home when she hears that something is going on. Something is stirring back home, that God's providing food. So she has this idea of familial safety, of this, them being provided for. She just wants them safe. She wants them well. She has seen that they have dealt with her so kindly in this course. Both those who have died, but also those who remain alive, which is essentially just Naomi. And she has seen this goodness, and she wants them cared for. She does truly, I believe, love them. And there's such a strangeness here, because we see that, and we talked about last week. I think there's a great chance that Elimelech, in fear, leaves Bethlehem. In fear, goes into a foreign land that was an antagonist. Remember, this occurs at the time of the judges. We talked about this last week. Moab, the Moabites, one of these judges. In fact, for 18 years. I shouldn't say judges. They're one of the foreign lands that oppressed them, that judges had to deliver them from. On top of that, the Jews were forbidden from intermarrying with other nationalities that had false gods. We made the point, it's not about racism. It's about, because you could certainly marry another race and have the same God, but this was about intermarrying with foreign gods. It was about idolatry. And they were Moabites, and they had many gods. There's a lot against her. There's a lot against them. This is not going to be a good situation wherever they stay for somebody. And she's basically saying, we just need to go to our places. So as she does this, what do? They refuse. They basically say, no, we're going to stay with you. Don't make us do this, because there's love. But then she gets into the real practical. Okay, she gets into some really practical considerations here. She basically says, okay, then what are you going to do? Number one, I'm too old to get pregnant. On top of that, way too old to have a husband, so this little order thing's not going to happen. And even if I were to marry, even if I were to have children, are you going to wait around until they get to be of age, not marrying anyone at all between now and, I don't know, the next 17, 18, 19 years? Is that the kind of commitment we're talking about? So it becomes exceedingly practical for her to make this argument of, you need to be somewhere that is safe and somewhere that you consider to be home. And as she draws that line, she says, no husband, I have no prospects of children, I have essentially no home. If you come with me, you're going to be the foreigner. It's in your own best interest. And of course, at the result of this, what do we see? Verse 14, then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And so we know at that point, at those practical considerations, the point was made and accepted by Orpah, and she returned home. Of course, the way it's articulated is that she returned home to all that home was, including not just her mother's house, her father's protection, but also to her foreign gods. The practical cares of the world, as presented by Naomi, were enough to convince one of them. But Ruth persists. So you have this consideration of safety in verses 6 through 10. You have practicality coming through in 11 through 14. But then you have this consideration, and I just was lacking a word, and so I just called it solidarity. This consideration of solidarity, and that is, once you draw the line in this world of all the reasons why to go back and make sure that you are taken care of in this world, you've literally laid down the gauntlet and said, and she wasn't daring her, I truly believe that Naomi desired for Ruth as well to go back. But in the midst of all this, whatever is going on with Ruth, and even though we love the statement that Ruth makes in the following verses, it's a very poetic, beautiful sound. I mean, it's in a lot of weddings. It's on rings. It's on my ring actually right now. This idea of this kind of fidelity and commitment, this solidarity that she voices with Naomi, I do think it's very significant. Whether or not we could call it a conversion or not, I don't know. I go back and forth. It's at least conversion leaning, because this is a strong statement that she makes in this solidarity. Despite it being less safe, despite it being impractical, Ruth says, I love you. I'm going with you. This is my calling. In fact, I'm going to die with you. And I love Naomi's response, because it's pretty much, this is the closest that we get to women understanding what men go through in an argument with their wives. I'm not changing her mind. Yes, dear. Which anybody that's been married for any length of time, it doesn't take a rocket scientist. You know that's pretty much the first piece of advice that you give young men. Learn to say yes, dear, often. And as we mentioned before, you can be right in the wrong way, and you probably will be most of the time. So, yes, dear. You can deal with any of the fallout later on. When she realizes that there is no changing her mind at all, what does she do? Well, 15 through 18 says this. Let's just pick up 16. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything, but death parts me from you. This is why I'm saying it's at least conversion leaning, because she is literally calling down the curse of God onto her life if she doesn't follow through with this. Again, it's really beautiful. And of course, what possible next thing? She already said, okay, first it's safe. Now it's impractical. I mean, think this through. Clearly, there's just no trump card that Naomi has at this point to go past what Ruth just said. So she says, okay, let's go. How much she prepared her for what she was going to face, no idea. For all we know, Ruth had not had any occasion at all to have been in Judah. In fact, here's an interesting part of her commitment. I told you about the mother's house, the father's house. In fact, in Ruth 2:11, if you want to just flip the page, you can see this where you have this verse that makes it clear when Boaz says, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and come to a people that you did not know before. Her father was alive. So she left the safety, she left the practicality, all of this. We didn't have that articulation earlier, but now as we look at the context, we know. She literally did leave everything that the society would have said would have protected her and given her any hope of a future, all for the sake of her love for Naomi. What a commitment she makes. Now, in the course of this, I want us to spend our time focusing on 19 through 21 as well. Because here you go with these considerations. There's safety considerations, practical considerations. There's this solidarity of them coming together and say, okay, we're in this together. I can't change your mind. Come with me. And then they arrive. Verse 19. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? And then what does it say? It said, well, clearly she heard them say this in whatever regard, to whatever extent, and she's saying, I don't even recognize that name any longer. Don't call me that. Call me Mara, because her perspective is the Lord has dealt with me very bitterly. She had already referenced this in her practical considerations to the two daughters-in-law, when she basically says, I'm sorry that you have to share in what's gone on between the Lord and my house. This is all, for me at least, this is a little bit of a lean into, I think it's very probable that they left, that Elimelech was disobedient in leaving, and they are seeing, as she is seeing, some consequential fallout in all of this, in what she's going through. So these translations in this crisis, so we had the considerations. What do we consider during the crisis? She considered all these things, and then she had to move. And when I say translations, I don't mean languages. I mean literally translating from one place to another, from one state of mind to another. And that's what happens when they travel and go back west, back over and around the Dead Sea, back to Judah, back to the homeland. There are some things going on here that are important for us to recollect. First of all, these translations, yes, it is from one place to another, but there's a couple of things I think are important to understand. She was in the fields working in Moab when she heard that the Lord was doing something. Here's the indication of what we have of what the Lord was doing. It's the last two words of the chapter. Don't miss it. It's incredibly exciting. Barley harvest. I mean, there's nothing falling from the sky. The ground just starts to give way again to some fruit bearing. The wheat and the grain, which they can make everything from to sustain life, is starting again. That's how she sees it. She sees famine, death, and barley all at the hand of a providential God. Now, we could argue, well, that's, in the context, they were just ignorant. So instead of looking at science, they just looked at, the skies. And that's just kind of the way they were, because they were ignorant of really the factors going on. Or do we need to start taking our cues a little more from what we see in the text to understand that, no, I'm not saying blame God for everything, but I am saying do not discount that God is still at work. He either causes or allows all things. We have to acknowledge it, but we do not have to fully understand it. Clearly at this stage, Naomi doesn't fully understand all that's transpired. She simply knows this, what she's articulating here. Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. Tough pill to swallow. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Isn't that interesting? When she left with Elimelech from Bethlehem, why? From a food standpoint, they were empty. But in the loss of husband and children, and all future hope in the world, aside from just being able to have a bowl of grape nuts, she considered when they left Bethlehem, they were full. Perspectives were changing in light of all the events that had occurred. And she says now she comes back empty. Now, I don't think she meant anything against Ruth, who's probably standing there. Hello, I'm here. I don't think there's anything like that going on. I think she feels the full weight of the loss of what she's gone through. In fact, I think there's echoes going on in Ruth's mind of what she just left. There's a perspective of what does full and empty really mean? Because she knows why they came. She was married to her son. She's a Moabite. She just left safety and future to a land that was antagonistic, that was an enemy. Trusting the provision of a woman that, by her perspective, when you are a widow, you are homeless. But Naomi knows something better. See, you could go back to Genesis 38 and you could see some other arrangements where at the beginning of the orchestration of society that God puts together for his people, for his covenant people, one of the things he arranges is the care for widows in their society. In the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, it is written down that there is a way that the widows in Judah will be cared for by family members. There's at least a chance, there's at least a hope. So while she's in the field in Moab, she hears that the Lord is doing something. But as we see this play out, guys, because it's not long at all before she starts to immediately put Ruth in a situation where hopefully some of this arrangement of care will start to take place that is already written down in God's law. though the immediate circumstance was crisis, but then she heard of hope to counter that circumstance, which again is having a place to be taken care of. There's an ancient word that is lingering back there that she knew. It's not necessarily about God doing something new right now. It's remembering that he has said something that still stands. Don't we respond to crisis too often in this way? Where something happens, we look for a new way out, but we forget that there are some ancient words that have reminded us that God will care for his own. It doesn't mean you flip on the TV and look for some new translation or new interpretation through some heretical prosperity preacher. No, you turn that stuff off and you read the word of God providing for his people safety and security. But you know what? If you read it rightly, as we did in 1 Peter, you're reminded that that provision and that hope may not be met fully in this world, but we know that he's got a place for us. We know that he has us. We also know that while we're in this world, he will not leave us alone. I don't know that Naomi really took to heart in the moment, but as time goes on, you will see she absolutely fully embraces what a gift Ruth the Moabite is to her. And she is a gift of God, literally saving her life in almost every way. Her theological perspective, in actual her provision, and then bearing children, all the spoilers. So from one place to another in the crisis, they translate locations. And God does that. God sometimes does that with us, even with our locales. We may see it or may not see it, but some situation forces us to change where we are physically even living. But we need to understand there's always something greater going on. What we have to discern is sometimes we leave and run from God, hoping we're going to find some kind of solace in this world. And we've stopped trusting in God. You have to decide, at what point of the move am I in? Am I in the running away from God part, or am I returning back to the Lord regardless of where I'm located? You may be Naomi, you may be Ruth, you may be some obscure person that you're just noticing. Look at what God has done because you've just never left home. God is still at work. And he translates people from one location to another because he is changing their perspectives from one to another, from self and world to him. But it requires the acknowledgement of these things that Naomi is talking about. I went away full. The Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? Isaiah 45, 5-7 says, I am the Lord and there is no other. Beside me there is no God. I equip you though you do not know me, that people may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is none besides me. I am the Lord and there is no other. I form light, I create darkness, I make well-being, and I create calamity. I am the Lord who does all these things. So that we know he is the Lord, our God. And it begins in a moment of crisis with acknowledging that God was not absent from the crisis or the calamity. He either caused or allowed it, whatever language you want to use for his providence, his sovereign hand in difficulty. But it is critical that you at least acknowledge that God is there. You don't have to understand it. In fact, I would caution you against trying to fully. Look to the ancient words. See how they form the tapestry of understanding God's character, his nature. Because if you don't, I promise, guys, even though we're not Greeks, I promise you will drift into a Greek mythology view of who God is. That he's capricious, that he is just this God that is so sensitive that if we don't give him enough prayers, he weakens, and he's just kind of mean sometimes because he's just self-centered like that. You will drift into that if you will not let the Word of God stave off that selfish kind of thinking. You know what that is? That is fashioning God in your image because that makes sense to you. And that's what we do in crisis. We can't reconcile that God is good and God is sovereign and God could be behind this, because I don't see anything good coming out of this at all. And as soon as you take that sentiment and apply it to God, you are immediately making God an idol that looks a whole lot like you. Because that you can get. You can get someone being mean. You can get someone being payback. But God knows the beginning from the end. Because you know what? Again, my challenge to you is this. Put this in your thinker. God is not bound by space or time. So it's not as if God looks into the future and just does something about it. No, because God is not bound by any clock, any calendar, anywhere. If God sees future, it's only to condescend to our limited ability to think like that on some kind of linear timeline. God's already there. Whatever there is for him. It's all one complete, total existence with no end and no beginning. So if that doesn't mess with the noodle just a little bit, then you will be forced somehow to reconcile God to be a little bit more understandable. Now again, I'm saying this totally believing and trusting that we have not mined the scriptures anywhere close to what is knowable about God. We have to keep digging. We have to keep knowing. We have to keep pressing into it. No matter what our age, no matter where our life development is, no matter how young or how old, we've got to keep pressing into what does the scripture reveal about him. But understand too, when it doesn't reveal something, we've got to be okay with that because we trust him. And Naomi is acknowledging that God is the God of calamity as well. She still sees him in it, but she doesn't see the relief yet. All she's doing is remembering ancient words that in her land there will be care. And Ruth comes along with her and she doesn't know what that's going to look like. All they do, as you're going to see here, is what I would hear from my mom all the time. You just got to take that one step at a time. Naomi literally lives that out as we go on with this story beginning next week. So she's gone from delight to bitterness, from fullness to emptiness, from the familiar to the foreign. That's what's odd. She was familiar with her household in Moab, but now she's back home, but home is completely foreign to her because everything that defines you is family, and they're all now gone. So it's like living in a foreign situation. And yet, those two action-packed words, barley harvest, that God has been making provision, that there is going to be care, that they will eat, but there's a whole lot more to figure out besides food, right? And that's where the story goes from here. So here's what I would encourage you with considerations in whatever crisis you're in. Remember that there is that ancient word, and that ancient word is there to remind you of who God is, that he is present both in the good and in the difficult, in the blessing and the calamity. Let the word of God almost let there be, perhaps you're later in life, but even if you have a suspicion that God's word basically is something you learned in Sunday school, and it's just, there's something resonating, pull on that, pull it in, dwell on that. Go to some people around you, pull in the ancient word of God to remind you that he is still the God who is present. And remember, you're not alone. Now again, there may be some surprising sojourners that go with you at this stage of your journey. They may not be your go-to best friends. Maybe those people are just stuck on Facebook for you. But there may be some people really present. There may be a Texan for your Jerseyan. What is it? What do you call a New Jerseyan person? Just use guys? Is that about it? Okay. So, whatever the case is, but you don't know who's going to journey with you during this, trusting that God is putting it together. But the fact is, he's not going to leave you alone. At the very least, you have the body of Christ to walk with you. Remembering, we all, in that sense, are foreigners. And remember this, that as you remember the ancient word, and as you remember you're not alone, you're actually heading towards a particular destination, and you're never going to find that in this world. You already see Naomi leaning into that, right? When she gets back to a place that's very familiar, you hear her language of I have nothing. Essentially, you almost hear this, I have no hope in the world. Now, we'll see how God is so kind and so merciful and so gracious. But remember that you do have a home prepared for you by Christ. Christ said that if it was not the case, I wouldn't have told you. But that's only if you're in Christ. That's only if you believe that Christ faced the crisis of sin by entering into, in a sense, a foreign land, even though it was one that he made. John chapter 1 says that his own people rejected him. So it was not comfortable. He never dealt with a crisis related to sin except sin and its fallenness and its effects by bearing the weight of that on the cross. In fact, I could argue that Christ truly was the only one who's been truly alone in those moments on the cross when the Father even turned away because of the bearing of the sin and the curse upon him for those moments. And he went through that moment of crisis so that we would not have to go through the crisis of hell and damnation and being set apart from him for eternity. But you have to believe that he did it for you. You have to believe that he faced that crisis for you and he took your crisis for you. And that he is alive so that there's no repeating of those actions and you cannot somehow meet him halfway. You were dead in your sin and trespasses, and you needed this person who could respond to a crisis like this in the only way that God could. There was nothing safe about it. No one was going to voice their solidarity, and even when they did, they either denied him or they scattered. God invites you, you spiritual Moabites, you exiles, you foreigners, which we all have been at one point or currently are, to come to him, and he welcomes you. He welcomes you in, he welcomes you home, and he will give you new home, as we'll see as we go through Ruth. New home, new family. And this is a family that presses into something much more and much greater than just life here. Because again, we see these names show up in the lineage of Christ. What a beautiful act of redemption and grace. Let's pray. God, we thank you for your mercy to us and your kindness. We're grateful for how you have preserved us and seen fit to keep us near. God, you do allow and even cause crises in our lives, but it's for the purpose of us turning and acknowledging that you are God. And so, God, I pray that we would respond to that and consider that your word is made clear that you don't do it because you're mean. You do it out of love, actually. You do it because the greatest good we could possibly have is you. And when you press us into yourself, even when we are desperate and there's nothing else in this world that can save us, and we just simply cry out to you out of desperation, that is the nearest we get to the greatest blessing of all, at least to that point. So God, I pray that there may be some even now that they're seeing that they have tried again and again and again to deal with the crises in their life on their own. And they are realizing that they must, in fact, turn to God alone and trust that Christ alone can rescue them and save them. Not necessarily to make life easier, it won't be. Not circumstantially, but to have meaning and purpose and to know that even after death, there is a home for them. God, that will bring great comfort and peace and joy that pervades past the crises in our lives. We still hurt, we still weep, but we are never that far from some joy of seeing your purpose in your hand, your gospel being put on display. So God, draw some to you even this morning, and I pray too, Lord, cause some believer who has frankly, they've gone through so much and they have stopped kind of trusting in that ancient word. They have to admit that they've been trying to reconcile difficulty in their life. And perhaps they are victims of a great injustice and they are trying to modify you and their understanding of you to still keep you somehow in the mix of their lives and their minds, but to still reconcile what's happened to them. God, I pray that you would cause them to just know that you care and you love, but also to humble themselves before you, that they do not have to reconcile those things. They don't have to figure out why, such a thing happen, they need to simply know that you are not absent and you still have purpose and meaning and a plan in even the worst of circumstances. And God, like we even see in this part of the story, not to be performance-based people, but there are people watching. People notice the hurt in our lives and how we respond to it. And while we can't, think of that in certain terms, we do need to remember that as parents of children, as children of unbelieving parents, as brothers and sisters, as friends, as coworkers. God, may we have the hope that in Christ you have instilled in us through the powerful working of the Holy Spirit. For your glory and your name's sake we pray. Amen.